Anticipatory anxiety. So, turns out I'm not as much of a genius as I thought I was earlier this week. See, earlier this week, I was talking to my husband about a lot of stuff that was going on in my life, in personal life, work life, and I told him that I thought I had anticipatory anxiety, in that I was more anxious about kind of envisioning what the day or the future was going to hold than really actually sitting down and doing that thing that it was making me so nervous. I was more nervous about the anticipation of the event rather than when I was actually in the event itself. So I told him anticipatory anxiety is something like I thought that I might have, not realizing that it was actually a term that psychologists and other researchers and scientists use all the time. It's not really anything new or special or unique. It's something that whether you have a panic or anxiety disorder or not, you probably actually can relate to a little bit, because it is a very common manifestation of anxiety. And so, unfortunately, I did not come up with this idea. However, the good news is that because I didn't come up with this idea, it is actually very well researched, and I was able to spend a lot of time this week just kind of reading a bunch of different articles on how it's manifested in different people, as well as, of course, what do you do when you do start to feel this kind of anticipatory anxiety? And the good news is that there's a lot of great advice out there, and I'm excited to share it with all of you. Welcome to Drawn, the podcast that draws you in with stories of hope, healing, and even a little hustle while battling anxiety and depression. Think you have to wait until you've conquered your mental illness to start living a joyful, meaningful life? Think again. Conquering your mental illness is part of living a life you love, and we're going to figure it out together. I'm Katie Rochetko, and this is Drawn. So for the last few weeks, I would say that on a scale of 1 to 10 with my anxiety, 1 being none, 10 being off the Richter scale, my anxiety has been kind of at a healthy 5, kind of a 6, but I would still have some good moments, some good days in there that it would dip below a 5. I was kind of resting in a very median kind of a way. I was managing the stress that I was under pretty well. At least I think so. Ask my husband. He's probably a better judge of character than I am. But I was feeling really good about a lot of things. And the phrase, when it rains, it pours? Well, that was my week, this past week. And so one of the things that ended up happening that really triggered my anxiety was that at work, I had a special project that was due. And it was due on a timeline that I was not anticipating, an accelerated timeline that I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to keep up with. The thing about this timeline is that, of course, I set it for myself. I was the one who decided that this should be the timeline. This should be when my story airs on TV, because it makes the most sense with the context of the story. And yet, I did not think through exactly what that meant as far as what I was going to have to do in order to make that happen. So basically, that was a huge trigger for my anxiety, was my TSR, my Targeted Special Report. It's basically just a special project, a special story that we in broadcasting work on for a very, very long time usually, and then it gets aired, and it's usually a little bit of a longer story. It might be a little bit more investigative. And so it's kind of a big deal when you do get a TSR and you now get to put all of this extra energy and effort and resources into it and then put it out there into the world, right? So it's a very exciting opportunity, but it can also come with a lot of stress because the stakes are a lot higher. So my TSR was due last week, and I didn't know that was when it was going to air. It was going to air on Monday, and I didn't know it was going to air on Monday until the Wednesday before. Now, here's the deal. In all honesty, 5 days is a very long time for a story, because we actually, in news, we tend to turn stories within hours sometimes of them happening. Sometimes it's even more spontaneous and immediate than that. So 5 days is actually a long time. However, because of my anxiety, it did not feel like nearly enough time. And there were a lot of different steps in completing my TSR that led me to feel like I was not going to have enough time to get it all done, on top of all of my other stuff that I had to do. So a lot of my fears centered on I wouldn't be able to write a very good script. My boss or my peers wouldn't actually like the finished product. I wouldn't get it done on time. It would take a really, really long time to finish, or that I would get sick trying to finish it because I have workaholic tendencies where if I'm working really hard on a project, I have a really hard time remembering to eat. I have a hard time sleeping because my mind is just racing a lot. And so all of these factors tend to play out in the fact that I get really, really sick when I'm stressed out about a project or a test or any number of things that is taking an extra amount of time and energy because I neglect a lot of my other healthy habits. So all of that to say is there was a lot of things that I was anticipating going wrong with this project, and that anticipation really was playing out in my anxiety. And that, let's take the first step, right? When you've got a story, you've got all of the interviews shot, and you're ready to start writing, for 2 days, I was a nervous wreck thinking about sitting down at my desk and writing out my script. However, as soon as I sat down at my desk to write it, it took me 2 hours. The story I'd been working on for almost 2 months. I knew it backwards and forwards. I knew what I wanted to say, and I wrote it in 2 hours. It was really not that big of a deal, and yet you would think that based on how much anxiety I have over it, that I was being asked to move Everest. I wasn't. I was being asked to do my job, to simply write a script, to write a story based on all of the information that I had, and that is something that I do every single day. So why was today going to be any different? That's where my anxiety plays in. My anxiety has a tendency to tell me that this is going to be the exception to the norm, that this is going to be the story that sucks. This is going to be the project that fails. So not only was I dealing with this one particular area of my life of elevated stress, but I also had some other things going on in my life. I had a wonderful and spontaneous visit from a friend and her 2 kids. I had a half a dozen other regular stories to shoot, write, and or edit. I had a lot more late nights and not restful sleeps, as well as I was completely just out of my routine. No big deal at all by the end of the day, especially when you get to break your routine for something as great as having a friend visit you. But all of this was at the same time happening as my special report. So it was a lot. It was a lot of changes going on at the same time, which obviously you know because you've probably heard me talk about it. Change, good and bad, can trigger anxiety because we like the status quo. We like things to stay the same. We don't like the unknown. And so change, like in this case, which was really good, having my friend come and visit me, was still change. And that resulted in a little bit of added anxiety. However, like I said, a lot of the things that I was anticipating happening in the negative way didn't actually happen. I told you that I was able to write my story in just a couple of hours. I was able to edit my story, in just a day. It really wasn't that big of a deal. My story aired just fine. My peers and my boss respected the story. I was able to, get a lot of feedback from the community about how good it was. And so it was just one of those things where all of my fears leading up into the point that my story actually aired, none of those actually happened. And so it's kind of one of those things where, why was I so anxious about the anticipation of the event? Because I know that when push comes to shove, I will be able to do the work. I've always been able to do the work. I've never had a problem getting anything done, especially when it comes to work. And on top of that, if this was the project that did not get done, it was not going to be the end of the world or the end of my career. And so kind of putting it into perspective eventually did help me, but I had to get through a whole lot of anxious nights to get to that point. So all of that to say is that this is what was going on in my life, and this is why I really wanted to research anticipatory anxiety. Before we actually talk about that though, let's first start with anticipation. We grew up anticipating things, right? I can't be the only one who got really excited for the first day of school, for Christmas morning and all of our presents, or for your birthday, knowing that it was going to be a whole day all about you. Or, one of my favorite memories was anticipating my grandmother's visit, right? We grew up anticipating things, but I think if we look back on our childhood, especially if we had a very stable childhood, you can think back on the situations in your life where you were anticipating something, and there's probably a lot of positive, good things that you were anticipating. But somewhere in your childhood, you started to anticipate more negative things. Maybe you didn't have a stable home. Maybe you had a home that was constantly in chaos, and so you started to negatively anticipate a parent coming home because you didn't know what kind of mood that person was going to be in when they walked in the doors. Maybe you started to anticipate something negative happening at school because school wasn't really where you felt safe. Maybe you were bullied. Maybe academics weren't your thing. And so, every time a test would come up, you just had this anxiety that like you were going to fail because maybe something in your past had told you that you weren't very smart or that you wouldn't be able to keep up with the work. There was a shift in our life at some point when we stopped really anticipating positive things and we started anticipating more negative things. And depending on kind of your trajectory in life and your brain makeup, maybe that has resulted in anticipatory anxiety. So what exactly is this idea of anticipatory anxiety? Well, according to Very Well Mind, anticipatory anxiety happens when people experience increased anxiety and stress when they think about an event that will happen in the future. While this is not a distinct mental condition, anticipatory anxiety is a common symptom of other conditions, including panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. So here's something that I think is really interesting about anticipatory anxiety is that it can actually be triggered by major or minor events. So in my case this week, I would kind of consider my TSR a more major event. A lot of the times it's like a presentation at work or a social event that you have to go to. Things like that might be considered a major event. They don't necessarily have to be a major life-changing event, but just a major event in general. Or they can be a minor event. Minor event meaning just the drive to work can be anxiety-ridden. Sometimes it's going to the grocery store can cause you anxiety. A lot of the times for people who do have some kind of panic disorder, this idea of anticipatory anxiety centers around their fear that if they get put into this situation, they're going to have a panic attack. So let's say the grocery store, for example. If you've ever had a panic attack in the grocery store, you might develop anticipatory anxiety just thinking about going to the grocery store because you're afraid that you're going to have another panic attack in aisle 13 with the peanut butter. Something I really want to reiterate is that just because you've never been diagnosed with any kind of anxiety disorder doesn't mean that you still can't relate to anticipatory anxiety. I think this idea of anticipatory anxiety is very relatable in the sense that it's human nature to fear the unknown. It's human nature to want things to stay the same, to maintain the status quo, to live inside of our comfort zone. And so when you are about to do something that takes you out of that comfort zone, there is going to be a natural level of anxiety, whether it is giving a presentation at work, whether it is having a confrontation with a friend or a loved one, even whether it's, going to a party even. I mean, you may have a little bit of social anxiety, but it's nothing that is consuming your life. It's nothing that's taking over your ability to function and have fun. But of course, I do mostly talk to the people who do experience mental illness because that's the position that I come from. I like to lead from the trenches, and so I want you to know that a lot of what I had to say is all the stuff that I'm learning right there along with you. So anxiety has this tendency, I think, to trick us into thinking that this is how we take control of a situation. Anxiety in a lot of ways can be the motivating factor in over-planning, over-analyzing, over-preparing. We like to think of all of the possible scenarios of everything that could possibly go wrong, and we say that we do that because we want to be prepared. But if you think about it, anxiety is one of those things that causes so much chaos in our brains that it kind of does the opposite, in that it really prevents us from actually being able to logically and realistically prepare for the situation we're about to face. One of the articles I read actually said it this way: "We think we anticipate to prevent disasters, but this is rarely the case. This unconscious anticipation of disasters often gets us exactly the opposite of what we want, and the unconscious fears that we hold impact the fear centers of the brain and disrupt any actual plans that the brain can come up with." Another article I read said anticipatory anxiety creates an illusion of control, and in life, the key is not to control everything, but to recognize what you can and what you can't control and to live accordingly. So let's just be real for a second. A lot of the time, our anxiety really is focused on things beyond our control. The best thing you can do is just trust that everything is going to work out. But of course, positive thinking when you're in the depths of despair, when you are overridden with all of these thoughts of sadness and grief and anxiety, it can be very, very difficult to think positively. And I totally get that because I have been there in the past in the extreme sense, and I definitely still have bouts of that even now. And so I totally get that the whole, just think positively is great advice, and you understand that it can work. However, sometimes you don't really need that kind of advice. What you need is something more tangible, something more practical, something that you can actually do and see more immediate results in, because there's a lot of things about dealing with a mental illness that are long-term, that are going to take years and years and years of work to be able to see any kind of difference or any kind of positive impact. So what can we do right now as we're dealing with this anticipatory anxiety the next time it flares up? So like I said, a lot of the research that I did focused on things like think positive thoughts, do something to distract you from the anxiety or focus on something else, journal your feelings, practice deep breathing. This is all kind of that fluffy stuff that I will admit does work to a degree. However, if you're like me, you probably have done all of this stuff and it hasn't worked, or you are still in the process of doing these things and making it part of your routine, but it still isn't something that's going to help you in the moment when an anticipatory anxiety flares up. So I really wanted to find the advice that was out there for this specific type of anxiety and what to do in the moment. So what I really wanted to do was, in my research, look for the more tangible things that are very specific to this kind of anxiety. And I found 3 things that I think is actually pretty cool, and I'm excited to try these out for myself. So the first thing is called progressive muscle relaxation. Now, this is something very, very simple and can be done in the moment. So let's say you're having one of these kind of anxiety flare-ups and you're starting to feel out of control. Just take a moment and curl your toes. Curl them really, really, really tight and then slowly let go. Maybe you want to do the same thing with your hands at the same time. Curl your fingers into a fist and then let go. So I really think that this one's interesting and I'm excited to try this one myself. Another bit of advice that I found was to ask yourself the following questions. If this is bad, what is good? If this is so horrible, what can I look forward to? If this makes me feel sick, what can make me feel great? I like this idea more than just, think positive thoughts, but it's kind of in that same realm, right? It's like, okay, if I'm anticipating something bad happening at work, let me also take a moment to think about what is something good that is going to happen. If this is so horrible, what can I look forward to? So let's say you really are going to experience a bad day at work. Maybe it's just one of those days that you are so nervous about because it's 6 hours of back-to-back meetings and it's causing you a lot of dread. What can you look forward to after that? Because you know that you can get through that, but now let's give yourself some kind of immediate reward to be like, hey, if I get through these 6 hours of meetings, I'm done for the day and I'm going to go get myself an ice cream. It could be as simple as a frosty treat. It's just kind of that idea of like positive thinking, but in a very tangible, practical way. Asking yourself these specific questions, giving yourself answers, and then focusing on those answers. And the third thing that I really think is important is to reason with yourself. The article I read said it's important to counter the unrealistic and irrational thoughts with more realistic and evidence-based thoughts. However, I think that when you are in a thought spiral, it can be very challenging to try and disrupt that unless you have somebody else to help you through that. And so my caveat to this advice is simply to not only reason with yourself and try and give yourself that solid, rational advice and evidence-based thinking, right? But also talk it out with somebody that you trust, because if you find somebody that you trust, hopefully they're the kind of person who can tell you that's an irrational fear. You don't need to be afraid of that. And they can help you by saying those things in a way that might click with you, in a way that you trying to tell yourself just won't. So here are some of my final thoughts on this idea of anticipatory anxiety. The first is the obvious. This is a process and a journey, so give yourself grace. It is something that I am still very much struggling with, and it's something that I think I'm going to struggle with for a while. And there are going to be moments of anxiety in which I apply these techniques and I feel like, yes, that worked. I have a handle on my anxiety. And then the very next day, I'm going to have another anxiety attack in which these techniques don't work, or they go completely out the window, out of my brain, and I completely forget them. And now suddenly I'm spiraling again. So we both need to give ourselves a lot of grace in that this is a journey. This is something that's going to have good days and bad days and every type of day in between. The next thing is that this is, of course, one of my favorite sayings, but knowledge isn't power, applied knowledge is power. And now I've just given you 20 or so minutes worth of knowledge that you can now apply to your own life, and that is what's going to empower you. The final thought that I want to leave you with is that I understand we have a lot going on in each of our lives. However, when it comes to anticipatory anxiety, a lot of the times it's our thoughts focusing on the future and only envisioning the worst. So what is the opposite of that? The opposite of that is hope. Hope is looking at the future and seeing a bright light. Hope is looking at the future and seeing kindness, love, compassion, beauty, grace, all of those things that we are blind to when we are in the middle of an anxiety attack. So my hope for you is that whatever it is that you are anticipating about the future, that you will hope for the wonderful rather than worry about the disastrous. Thank you for listening to the Drawn Podcast, empowering women battling anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses, where I believe we've been drawn together to create a life we love. You can find more amazing content at my website, KatieRochetco.com, or follow me on Instagram at The Drawn Collection.